Hello everyone, I am Vikramjit Dutta and today I am going to present a very engrossing, knowledgeable and well written paper. The paper was published in the Journal of Earth and Planetary Sciences in the year 2018. So the title of the paper is Seismic Behavior of Mountain Belts Controlled by Plate Convergence Rate. The authors of the paper are Luca Dal Zilio, Yolovan Dintarev, Taras Figueria, and Kaspersky Pangera. So there is a famous proverb in earth sciences that we learn geology the morning after the earthquake. So basically, although we cannot predict when and where the next earthquake will occur, but by studying the seismic events, we can gather some knowledge regarding the future events. Likewise, in this paper, the authors have tried to study the seismic behavior of mountain belts and how they are related to different tectonic and kinematic processes. Before getting into the in-depth analysis of the paper, we must learn about the Gutenberg-Ricker law. By this law, we may forecast the maximum size and frequency of future seismic events. So basically in seismology, the Gutenberg-Ricker law expresses the relationship between the magnitude and total number of earthquakes for a given region. As we can see in in the second picture, the n value corresponds to the frequency of earthquakes and m value corresponds to the magnitude or size of the earthquake. As we can see in this picture, as the value of n increases, the frequency of earthquakes gradually decreases. Now, this B value is very important in seismic studies. It is commonly used to describe the relative occurrence of small and large events. Uh, the low B values correspond to more active zones, and higher B value will correspond to less active zones. Now, this B value can also be used to relate to difference in geological factors of the crust, tectonic regime, differential stresses, style of faulting, and degree of heterogeneity. Now, coming back to the introduction part of the paper, so the first basic question that arrives in our mind is that how these mountain building processes are related to seismic events or earthquakes, etc. Now, studies over the past few decades have suggested that variations in seismicity of the mountain chains are directly related to the variation in their geological structure. Now, scientists have already tried to model the seismic events with mountain building using some numerical models and analog experiments. But because of the large computational time stamp, which is around thousands of years, these transient and short-term processes like earthquakes and seismic events are not included in this model. On the other hand, a scientist called Dalker, in one of his papers, suggested that dynamic rupture simulation can physically consistently model a rupture. But for that, we have to provide a set of initial conditions. What are those initial conditions? Like stresses, strength, fault geometry, etc. However, scientists have tried to model the seismic events with the mountain building, but these models don't work properly. Like there are many limitations of these models. Uh, they assume planar faults and they cannot account for anelastic deformation. Consequently, such models cannot address the complex fold and thrust built structures, and they don't take into account the long-term mountain building processes. Now, in this research paper, the authors basically tried to overcome all these limitations by using a physics-based, self-consistent seismothermomechanical model. This model captures the dynamics of both long-term origin-based scale deformation and short-term seismic behavior. After that, they analyzed their model based on continent collisions where different plate convergence rate are systematically tested to study its effects on seismicity style. Now, after all these things, they verify their numerical model, calculating similar physical quantities for natural examples. For example, in Alps or Ap- Zargos or in Himalayas, and they compare their result, as well as they find the B values and corresponding Gutenberg Richter distribution. So next we'll try to analyze how they have made their model. So the methodology section has mainly four parts. The first part is the basics of seismothermomechanical model. In the second part, we'll study about the model setup. And then in the third part, we'll know about the modeling procedure. And in the final part, we'll evaluate the Gutenberg-Richter distribution and we'll calculate the B value. So let's go to the first part. So for for making a fully working seismothermal mechanical model, the authors have employed a numerical STM code which combines the conservative finite differences on a fully staggering grid and the marker insert technique. Now, in for making this model, they basically use this formula. In this formula, as we can see, it is a relationship between deviatoric stresses and strain rates. Here, the G value, which is this one, is the shear modulus. This value corresponds to the effective viscosity, and this value is basically the square root of deviatoric stresses. Now, for calculating uh, the different parameters of this model, we need to calculate the steady state friction coefficient as well. For calculating the steady state friction, the authors have used this formula. Here, mu s and mu d are basically the static and dynamic friction coefficient, and chi is the amount of slip velocity induced. Basically, the positive chi values will correspond to weakening, and negative chi value will correspond to strengthening. So this is all about the basics of the seismothermic mechanical model. Now let us go to the model setup part. So the basic STM model the authors have set up looks something like this. Now the initial composition map looks is given in this A part, and this B part corresponds to the initial temperature distribution. The red part will mean higher temperature, and the blue part corresponds to lower temperature. Now, if we zoom into the oceanic oceanic plate, it looks something like this C part, and this D is basically a 1D lithospheric strength profile, which gives the corresponding initial geotherm. Now, what are the basic features of this model setup? So, the 2D model consists of a 4000 cross 250 km computational domain. Now, there are two continental plates which are of length of 1700 kilometer, and these continental plates are separated by a oceanic plate which has a length of 600 kilometers. Now this continental plate and the oceanic plate has basically three parts: the upper crust, the lower crust, and the lithospheric mantle. Now different thermomechanical parameters of these plates are calculated from different laboratory experiments. For example, the thermal structure of the oceanic lithosphere was calculated from the half space cooling model. Also, one more thing to mention, that to initiate the subduction, a weak zone was imposed on the right ocean continent transition, which is this one. This is the weak zone. Now, this weak zone cuts through the whole lithosphere mantle with an angle of around 30 degree. This is around 30 degree. This is the basic of the model setup. Next, we will go to the next part, which is the modeling procedure. So the modeling approach has basically two parts. First one is the long-term evolution part, which is basically the closure of the oceanic basin, the subsequent continent collision, and the mountain building process. The short-term seismic, the second part is the short-term seismic cycle, which basically simulates cycle of reoccurring interseismic and co-seismic periods. Basically, in the first stage, the inertia is negligible and the friction is constant. But in the second stage, the simulation starts with the distribution of physical properties from the long-term simulation. In a typical seismic cycle, when the maximum strength is locally reached, the instability is fed through the feedback of decreasing viscosities. This increases the slip velocity, which decreases the slip rate dependent friction and strength, and which in turn decreases the viscosity even further. So basically, as the seismic cycle starts, the viscosity of the model decreases. This is all about the modeling procedure. Now let's go to the next. So basically, for calculating the Gutenberg-Richter distribution and the V value, the authors use a rupture detection algorithm. From that rupture detection algorithm, they calculate the rupture width. From that rupture width, they use a method from which they calculate the moment magnitude. This formula is used for that. After calculating the moment magnitude, they calculate the completeness magnitude MC from a probability distribution, which looks something like this. Now, after calculating the value of MC, they use Aki's maximum likelihood method to calculate the value of B. Here, B is calculated from the value of MC. In this section, we outline the main results obtained from two sets of numerical experiments. The first set, which is set 1, the numerical experiment, in this set, the numerical experiment were designed to cover the same cumulative convergence. Here we assume the range of convergence velocities from 10 mm per year to 50 mm per year. And in the second set, which is set B, the numerical experiment is designed to study the importance of orogenic type and geometry on seismic behavior. And these are determined with respect to the role of convergence rate. So going forward to the set A. So the long-term mountain building has mainly three parts. The first part is pro-foldland basin, which is the left part, the orogenic wedge middle part, and the right part, which is retro-foldland basin. It is clear from the picture that the composition shows a broad orogen mark by nap stacking in the pro-wedge part and cluster shortening in the retro-wedge part. Now a fixed conversion rate of 10 cm per year is imposed during the early phases of the model. Basically, when the oceanic plate consumption and ocean closure was happening, and as the model goes to the next stage, the contained collision starts and the convergence rate gradually steps down to a lower value. Now when the convergence rate comes near to 50 millimeter per year, the model is greatly affected by the buoyant and geological weak materials. As we can see at the onset point, the collisional rocks of crustal root affect the base of the plate's contact, increasing the degree of rheological coupling. Now the final structure which we get is characterized by a asymmetric fold and thrust belt structure. And the profoldland basin uh, is characterized by simple shear deformation and nap stacking, whereas the retrofoldland basin is characterized by pure shear shortening, thickening of the crust, and back thrusting. This is the back thrusting part. This image basically shows the short-term seismicity events occurring in the pro wedge, the orogenic wedge, and the retro wedge. In the pro wedge part, the normal faulting occur and they propagate to the lower continental plate. In the orogenic wedge, basically seismic energy releases in the mega thrust part, and in the retro wedge part, seismic energy is released by reverse faulting, and this reverse faulting propagates from deep crust up to the subsurface. Now, if we calculate the Gutenberg-Richter parameters from this model, we'll get results which look something like this. The first image, the A part, basically gives us the Gutenberg-Richter distribution. The B part gives us the relationship between the plate convergence rate and estimated maximum magnitude. As we can see, it has a linear relationship between them. The C part gives us a relationship between the rate convergence rate and B value, which also gives a linear relationship, and the relationship between the plate convergence rate and cumulative seismic moment release is given in the D part. So basically from this BCD result, we can clearly see that the frequency magnitude distribution follows the power law. And as we can see in the E part, the seismic moment released is shown in different parts in megathrust, upper plate, orogenic wedge, lower plate, and it is shown as a function of plate convergence rate. So the results from the role of mountain ranges architecture, which comes under set B, is something like this. Now the A part corresponds to the composition map showing the orogenic wedge development. The B part is basically the 1D strength envelope profile, and the C part is the strain rate map, and the D part is basically the rupture event density map. From these results, we can clearly illustrate that the thermal crustal properties affect the structure and geometry of collisional orogens, and thereby their spatial distribution of seismicity. Now, comparing these models with the previous set of numerical experiments, we observe that the positive relations between plate convergence rate and cumulative number events, which is shown in this figure, and we can see that there is a linear relationship between convergence rate and MW maximum, and there is a linear relationship between B value and convergence rate. So these results therefore indicate that small variations in the radiogenic content of crustal rocks may have obvious effects on both the long-term formation and the short-term seismicity. In the discussion section, we will first discuss the physical mechanisms responsible for the control of plate convergence, and subsequently we will make a comparison between the Alps, Zagros and Himalayas and the numerical experiments. This picture basically shows a 1D lithospheric strength profile taken from the initial lithological sequence. Now, the this A and B picture basically shows the distribution of differential stress with depth. First with respect to temperature for A, and second with respect to strain rate for B. These pictures show that the temperature field and the strain rate distribution are mainly controlled by the plate convergence. Basically, an increase in convergence rate, for instance, allows the deeper subduction of lower temperatures, thereby deepening the brittle extent to the crust. Thus, the brittle behavior of upper crust deepens and the lower crust becomes more brittle. As we can see here, the brittle part is extended for lower crust and the brittle extent of upper crust is decreased. And from the sea image, we can see the distribution of seismic and aseismic behavior, and we can clearly see that uh, within the seismogenic depth range, seismic aseismic strain vary with plate convergence rate, and it demonstrates that the competition between seismic and aseismic strain has a strong influence on the seismic behavior of mountain belts. Also, in from the D picture, we can clearly see that the depth of the ductile and or brittle transition zone depends on convergence rate. As a result of that, the rupture width changes according to this rheological feedback. In the next stage, we will investigate the possible correlation between the increasing convergence rate and the deepening of the brittle strength. This picture basically shows the probability density distribution of hypocenters versus depth. For uh, for A it is numerical experiment and for B it is for natural. From A it is clear that for lower converging rate, the lower converging rate, the model is clearly unimodal, and for higher converging rate, the model is bimodal. As we can see, for 50 millimeter per year rate, the model is something like this, which is a bimodal distribution, and for the blue one, which is 10 millimeter per hour per year, the model is unimodal. And we can see the results find agreement with the seismicity data of our natural cases as well. As we can see, the Himalayas, which have a higher convergence rate, is bimodal, and the Alps, which is which has low convergence rate, is unimodal. For comparison purposes, the authors have collected the natural data from the US National Earthquake Information Center, and from that information they have plotted this result. So basically, the A picture is shows the frequency magnitude distribution of earthquakes for events in four orogenic belts, which are Alps, Apennines, Zagros, and Himalayas. And the B picture shows the relationship between plate convergence rate and maximum magnitude. The C picture shows the relationship between plate convergence rate and B value. Now, as we can see from the pictures, the slowly converging alpine and Apennine orogenic systems are dominated by an upper crust confined unimodal distribution of earthquake, and the rapidly converging Zagros and Himalayas reveal many earthquakes nucleating within the lower crust, which makes the unimodal distribution a bimodal distribution. And uh, our STM models suggested the same. As shown in this plot, uh, two of its governing Gutenberg-Riccati parameters are plotted against the convergence rate, and we find a positive linear relationship with sufficient confidence. The R value is 0.91 in this case, which is very high, and R value is minus 0.92, which is also very high. So these seismicity data support the hypothesis that an increasing in plate convergence rate leads to larger maximum moment magnitudes and smaller B values. As shown here, larger moment magnitude and smaller B values. Moving on to the conclusion part, the author systematically studied the influence of convergence rate on seismicity in active continent-continent collision orogens through using numerical models and comparison with earthquake data. And the results they got are listed in the following slides. So the first conclusion is using the innovative STM approach, authors have successfully simulated the feedback between long-term continental orogeny and related it with the deformation and short-term seismicity. Also, from studying the Gutenberg creature distribution, they have suggested that a inverse linear relationship between plate convergence rate and B value. Also, these results indicate a positive linear relationship between MW max and plate convergence. The third conclusion is high convergence rates reduce the average temperature of the origin, thereby increasing the brittle portion of the crust at the expense of the ductile portion. So the next conclusion is analyzing the results shows that the B value decreases linearly with differential stress for origins with higher convergence rate, which agrees with laboratory experiments and natural data. And these modeling results found a good agreement with general observations of seismicity patterns within the collisional origins. As, as shown in previous slides, Himalaya and Zargos origins are mainly characterized by bimodal distribution, whereas Alps and Apennines shows unimodal distribution, which is solely based on the convergence rate. Uh, and the last result conclusion that we can draw is the results show that the location of seismogenic faults may change according to the regional stresses and the main tectonic features. But the resulting seismic behavior is dominated by plate convergence rate. After going through this research paper, I have searched for some other papers which use the results of this paper. So I found some interesting ones like the seismo-hydromechanical modeling of the seismic cycle, which is a study for subduction zone seismicity. Basically, in this paper, they developed a new fully coupled poro-viscoelasto hydromechanical subduction model and found out that subduction interface permeability controls degree of locking of the megathrust. And another such interesting paper is bimodal seismicity in the Himalaya controlled by fault friction and geometry. In this one, the authors explored the causes of this bimodal seismicity and developed a two-dimensional seismic cycle model for the Nepal Himalayas and found out that the bimodal seismicity emerges as a result of relatively higher friction and a non-planar geometry of the main Himalayan thrust fault. Lastly, thank you for viewing this presentation. If you have any doubt, you can ask me in the comment section.